Okay, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to go through the long-run demand for labor. So far, we've explored how firms determine the optimal combination of labor and capital so that they can minimize costs while producing a certain level of output. This involved understanding the isoquants and the isocost lines and how firms use these two curves to make cost-effective decisions. In the short run, firms might face constraints that, limit their ability to change their input mix. So they can't choose between different levels of labor and capital. So for example, the pizza shop might be unable to acquire additional ovens or hire more workers beyond a certain point. However, in the long run, firms have more flexibility. We define the long run, remember, as having complete flexibility in order to choose all inputs into labor or into production. Excuse me. So firms can adjust both labor and capital, so their decisions on how much of each to use are much more dynamic. Long-run demand for labor examines how firms decide on the amount of labor they need when they have the flexibility to adjust both labor and capital. In the long run, firms are not only able to choose how many workers to hire, but how much capital to invest in. So they can make more strategic decisions about their input mix in order to maximize their profits, unlike what we saw in the short run. So in the long run, firms use their production function to determine the most efficient mix of labor and capital. So now they're concerned about both instead of just one before. This production function helps firms understand how changes in both the quantity of labor and in capital affect their total output, which helps guide them in making optimal decisions. So in the upcoming section, we'll be talking about in this lecture, we're going to explore how the long-run demand for labor is influenced by changes in wages, in capital costs, and in other factors. We'll then look at how firms adjust their labor and capital inputs over time to achieve their profit maximizing goals. So we're tempted to just simply shift the isocost line around the point COLR or C0LR, because if the firm chooses to produce without any workers, just relying on capital, the cost will be the same. However, in reality, this isn't the case. So this graph that we see here is not correct. It's not exactly what we're going to do. In reality, we have the scale effect and the substitution effect taking place, which will require us to do a little bit more work. The substitution effect basically is just that when we change the cost of one of the inputs, that's going to change how much of the other we're going to want to use. So for instance, if the wages for workers fall, it now becomes relatively cheaper to hire more workers, so they're going to shift away from using capital to more workers. However, we also have the scale effect, meaning how much a firm wants to produce. Because if costs change, if they either increase or decrease, that will affect how much a firm wants to produce for their total output. So if we would rotate around the point, like we see here, that is incorrect. That would say the firm's outlays are being held constant. Firms do not have to incur the same cost before. They don't have to, incur the same costs that they have before a wage change, after that wage change. And when wage rates change over time, they can choose either higher or lower costs depending on the situation and which way that wages change. So that's why simply rotating the ISO cost line will not work for this. We need a more precise way to analyze how a decrease in wages affects a firm's decision about labor and capital. So the entire ISO cost line ends up shifting, not just rotating. And this shift reflects the new budget constraint and how the firms adjust its input choices to maintain cost efficiency. In this graph, on the left, on the first side, we see how a decrease in wages lowers a firm's marginal cost. So this is going to potentially influence its production decisions. As we move from the marginal cost curve MC0 to MC1, this means that the profit maximizing decision is to increase production because the marginal cost is decreasing. So in this case, that's going to be moving from 100 units to 150 units. Because this firm faces a lower marginal cost, they can produce more and to maintain their maximum profit. Now, the second graph here shows the more accurate approach for what happens when wages or labor changes. So as in this example, wages fall, the ISO cost line shifts outward, reflecting the firm's increased ability to afford more labor or capital. This shift in the ISO cost line allows us to see how a firm's optimal input mix changes in response to the lower cost of labor, This is specifically because now wages are lower. We then find the new point where the shifted isocost line is tangent to the isoquant, indicating the firm's new optimal combination of inputs. This process shows us how firm adjusts its labor and capital usage to achieve cost minimization under the new wage conditions. Now, what is important to note is that the isocost line shifts out and it rotates at the same time. So because the wage rate changed, we're going to see a rotation in that line, and then it shifts out because in this case, it's the wages fell, so it's less costly for the firm. So we have two simultaneous effects going on here. Isocost line shifts outwards because of lower wages. The firm can afford to hire more labor with the same budget. So for a given amount of capital, the firm can now employ more workers. So let's put this in a more concrete perspective. Imagine that you have a fixed budget for your firm. If the cost of one item, in this case, labor, drops, you can now buy more of that item, or you could use your budget totally differently. The isocost line shifts outwards because the firm's budget stretches further to cover more labor or more capital. The line also rotates. This is because the slope of the isocost line reflects the ratio of the price of labor to the price of capital. When wages fall, that ratio decreases, which means the cost of labor relative to capital has changed. In this case, it decreases. This alters the slope of the line, which causes it to rotate. So we see both an outward shift and the rotation. So imagine a factory where wages fall. Before the wage falls, the factory can afford 10 workers and 5 machines. After the wage drops, the factory can now afford 15 workers and the same number of machines, the same 5 machines with the same budget. So the isocost line here shifts outwards to show that more labor can be hired. However, because the price of labor has fallen relative to capital, the rate at which the factory trades off labor for capital also changes. So that causes the line to rotate. So we have both going on simultaneously.